Today we examine a fantastic game where Grandmaster Eduard Gufeld sacrifices two pieces to none other than ex-world champion Vasily Smyslov. The sacrifices were so astonishing that they shocked not only Smyslov, but also another ex-world champion Mikhail Botvinnik and other grandmasters who all forgot about their own games and gathered around our board. So let's dive into one of the greatest games of all time. Smyslov starts with c4, the English opening. Gufeld replies with knight f6, and after knight f3 and g6, Smyslov makes an uncommon move. A move made by Richard Reti in his famous game against José Raúl Capablanca, b4, not only vacating the b2 square for the bishop, but also starting the expansion on the queen side. After bishop g7, bishop b2, short castle and e3, Gufeld plays b6, preparing the fianchetto of the bishop and the c5 advance. Smyslov occupies the center, and as his king is still in the center, Gufeld decides to open the position as soon as possible by playing c5. Smyslov exchanges on c5, and after b takes c, he continues his expansion, b5, grabbing more space and restricting the black knight. Besides that, white has created a pawn majority on the queen side. He has two pawns against black's one pawn. So white might get a chance to create a passed pawn on the queen side. Gufeld pushes the a pawn forward, creating some tension. Smyslov reinforces the b5 pawn, and in this position, the natural moves for black would have been either bishop b7 or d5, but instead, Gufeld finds a fantastic idea. He makes a move which goes against traditional opening principles. Instead of developing his queen side, he moves the already developed piece, knight e4, centralizing the knight and opening the bishop's diagonal. But this move looks like a terrible blunder, because after exchanging the bishops, white plays queen d5, attacking both unguarded pieces, the knight and the rook. So has Gufeld blundered? Let's see what happens next. First, he gives a check. And it turns out that if white makes the natural move knight d2, black solves all his problems. So he saves the knight by capturing, and white doesn't have time to capture the rook, because black would capture on f3 with double discovered check. So white must capture this knight. If he captures with the queen, black simply exchanges the queens, and the arising endgame would be more or less equal. If he captures with the knight, the black rook is still under attack, but black plays a takes b, and the queen would defend the rook, and after c takes b and d6, the position again would be equal. So, in order to keep both black pieces under attack, instead of knight d2, Smyslov decides to move his king. Of course, the king cannot move to d1, in this case knight takes f2, check with a fork would follow, so he plays king e2. Which of course looks terrible, because white loses the right to castle, the king is stuck in the center, he is closing the bishop's diagonal, so white will have problems in developing his king side, his queen side isn't developed either. However, both black pieces are still under attack. So, what next? How to solve this problem? White is ready to capture these pieces. Now you can pause the video and try to find Gufeld's fantastic idea. The obvious knight c3 check doesn't work. In this case, white simply captures. It's true, after queen takes c3, the white rook is also under attack, but instead of capturing the black rook, white first saves his rook, and the black rook is still under attack. The only move would be rook a7, but in this case, white wins a pawn with a tempo, again attacking the rook. The rook must return, and white is up a pawn, and he can even transition to the endgame, solving his king's safety problems. And after the exchange, black doesn't have any attack, white is up a pawn and winning. So knight c3 check doesn't work, and now you can see Gufeld's fantastic idea. Instead of knight c3 check, he plays bishop b7, attacking the white queen and inducing her to capture the bishop. So white wins a piece. Besides that, the rook and the knight are still under attack. And here comes the second fantastic move. Knight c6, sacrificing the knight, placing the knight right under attack of the pawn. And only now we can see Gufeld's idea. The queen's retreating diagonal is closed, so she is trapped. Black is ready to play rook a7, winning her. So what should white do? If he captures on d7, that looks too dangerous, because white king is in the center, his pieces aren't developed, and by capturing on d7, white would open the d-file, and black would get a chance to bring the rook into the attack. So black already have the queen, the knight, who takes part in the attack, and if the rook joins the attack with a tempo by attacking the white queen, that might be deadly for white. What else can white do? Of course, another move that comes to mind is accepting the sacrifice, the second sacrifice, by capturing the knight. But in this case, the white pawn has disappeared from b5. It has moved to c6. That means the b-file is open. Of course, black cannot play rook a7, as he doesn't have the knight, which used to be on c6 and control this square, but he can play rook b8, attacking the queen. And it turns out that white must give the queen up. She cannot move. If she moves, let's say to a7 or captures on d7, it doesn't really matter. Let's say she moves to a7, the black rook invades b2 with a check, and that would be the end. If the king moves to d3, knight takes f2 would be checkmate. If the king moves to d1, black would still capture on f2 with a check, with a fork, and after king c1, attacking the rook, black brings the second rook into play, defending his rook and creating terrible threats. The white queen is out of play, while all black pieces are very active. The white rook is under attack, and let's say if white saves his rook, he gets checkmated in 2 moves. Black would remove the knight, the defender of the c3 square, and after rook takes b1, queen c3 would be checkmate. Or if after rook b8, instead of queen a7, white captures d7, again the d-file would open, black would first develop the second rook with a tempo, and after the white queen moves, again the rook would invade b2, and again that would be the end. So the best move after rook b8 for white, instead of moving the queen, would be to let black capture it and try to develop his pieces and get rid of this great black knight by playing knight d2. But he of course cannot move the queen's knight on d2, because the knight must keep an eye on c3. If the knight moves to d2, the black knight would invade c3 with a check. So white must play king's knight on d2 and let black capture his queen, after which the very complicated position arises and computer evaluates it as more or less equal. And that's exactly what happened in our game, in a little bit different move order. Instead of capturing the knight right away, Smyslov plays knight d2 first, and only after rook a7 he captures the knight, and after rook takes b7, c takes b follows. So white, although he has lost his queen, white still has material advantage. For the queen he has a rook and 2 minor pieces. Besides that, he has a very dangerous passed pawn. However, his development is terrible. His king side, his queen side aren't developed, and his king is in trouble. And Gufeld continues creating threats. He plays queen b4, not only attacking the pawn, but also threatening to invade b2, after which the unguarded rook would fall. Of course, white could have played rook a2, taking the b2 square under control, preventing the invasion of the black queen, after which black would eliminate this pawn, and again computer evaluates this position as this extremely complicated position, imbalanced position, as equal. But instead of this, Smyslov finds a more original idea. Instead of rook a2, he decides to sacrifice. He thinks that now it's his turn to sacrifice material. So in order to retain his dangerous pawn and develop his queenside as soon as possible and also eliminate this annoying great knight, he decides to sacrifice the exchange. He can afford that because he is up in material. So he captures on e4, letting the black queen invade b2 with a check, after which he develops the knight. The black queen captures the rook, but his pawn has survived. Besides that, he captures one more pawn, and he is still up in material. For the queen he has 3 minor pieces and a pawn, and a very dangerous one. Besides that, white is threatening to capture one of the black pawns, after which the knight will control the promotion square, and white would threaten to promote. That's why Gufeld brings his rook into play, rook b8. Now, of course, if white captures one of these pawns, black would capture on b7. For this reason, Smyslov finally starts thinking about the development of his kingside. He plays g3, creating a terrible threat. So, he is threatening to play bishop g2. The bishop will defend the pawn. That means the knight wouldn't be forced to defend it anymore, and white would be ready to capture one of these pawns, attacking the rook. Besides that, after bishop g2, of course, white will also attack the queen. But Gufeld finds another strong move, queen a3, moving the queen away from the discovered attack and also targeting the knight. And now it would be better for white to play knight d3, in order to bring the knight closer to the remaining army. But in this case, of course, black would capture on b7, and after bishop g2, which would attack the rook, and rook b8, it turns out that there is no way white can hold the a4 pawn. Black would capture it, after which his a pawn will turn into a passed pawn, and it will be really difficult for white to hold this position. So instead of this, in order to avoid this boring defensive position which wouldn't give him any active play, instead of knight d3, Smyslov decides to complicate the game. He captures on d7, attacking the rook. Of course, Gufeld captures on b7, attacking the knight. Now Smyslov plays bishop h3, developing the bishop and defending the knight. But it turns out that now this knight is another problem for white. It's too far away from the remaining pieces, and the only square it can return back into play is e5. But Gufeld plays queen d6, taking this square under control and creating a terrible threat of f5, closing the bishop's diagonal, after which the knight will fall. For this reason, Smyslov plays c5. The pawn is defended by the knight, and it controls the b6 square, so the knight can escape via b6, and from b6 it can jump back to c4, and it will be defended by the second knight, and white will continue the resistance. But Gufeld plays queen d5, not only attacking the rook, but also threatening queen h5 check, which would also target the bishop. f3, pairing both of these threats, and now if black plays f5, closing the diagonal, threatening to capture the knight of course moves to b6, attacking the queen, and after queen takes c5, knight c4, and white continues the resistance. Neither can black, instead of f5, capture this knight with the rook. In this case, after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, white finishes his development, and the rook supports a very dangerous passed pawn, and computer again evaluates this position as equal. For this reason, instead of f5 or rook takes d7, Gufeld makes a much stronger move. Rook b2, invading the second rank, pinning the knight and threatening to capture it. White must play rook d1, and only now e6, closing the bishop's diagonal and threatening to capture the knight. And it turns out that now that the knight, this knight, is pinned, white cannot play knight b6. In this case, after queen takes c5, the knight cannot move to c4, as black would simply capture it. This knight isn't defending it. So, instead of knight b6, Smyslov plays c6, defending the knight and sacrificing this pawn. If black captures the pawn, the black queen would stop defending the e5 square, and the knight returns into play via e5. For this reason, instead of capturing the pawn, Gufeld makes a stronger move. Queen c4 check. The idea is to invade d3. After king e1, that's exactly what happens. Queen d3, attacking e3. And the knight cannot return, neither via e5 nor via c5. In this case, after queen takes e3 check, black would simply capture this knight next move. Besides that, black has created a terrible threat. After queen takes e3 check, white will be forced to play king f1 and the knight will fall. And the only way of parrying this threat is bishop f1. After queen e3 check, bishop e2. So we have reached another critical position. Materially, the position is still equal, but strategically, white's position is terrible. His bishop is pinned, his knight cannot move, as black would capture the bishop and checkmate. The rook cannot move either, as the knight would fall. The king cannot move. If the king moves to f1 in order to unpin the bishop, the knight would fall. And the d7 knight cannot return into play because these squares are controlled by the dominating black queen. However, white still has one last chance. So you can pause the video now and try to find what white would have done if it was his move and how Gufeld prevents it. White's only chance is to bring this knight back into play, and the only way of doing that is by playing a5, taking the b6 square under control, and the knight via b6 can return. For example, if black makes the natural move rook c2, targeting the passed pawn, white plays a5, and after rook takes c6, knight b6, the rook can return to the second rank, and knight c4 would attack the queen, kicking her out of this great position. And after queen g1 check, knight f1, the knight defends h2. Next move, white might play knight d2, for example, opening the bishop's diagonal. The bishop isn't pinned anymore, and it will target the weak a6 pawn, and white can continue the resistance. For this reason, in order to prevent white from playing a5, Gufeld himself plays a5. So now this knight is doomed. Smyslov tries his last chance, f4, taking this square under control, hoping to play knight e5 next move, but again, prophylaxis, f6, preventing knight e5. So white is paralyzed, he is in Zugzwang. His pieces cannot move, so he plays c7. And, of course, threatening to promote, Gufeld plays rook c2, and now that the rook must control this pawn, Smyslov can play king f1, because black doesn't have time to capture the knight, as white will promote. So Gufeld captures on c7. And knight c4 followed. Of course, after rook takes c7, black is attacking the knight, so knight c4 defends the knight and also attacks the black queen. And now you can pause the video one more time, the last time, and find Gufeld's final blow. A relatively simple tactics this time followed. Gufeld captures on c4. White must capture, and the bishop stopped defending this square, so queen f3 check, also attacking the rook. The king must move to e1 to defend the rook, but now queen c3 check. Next move, black will capture the bishop, after which the a4 pawn will fall too. the black's a-pawn will turn into a passed pawn and the position will be hopeless for white. For this reason, Smyslov resigned. And now I recommend watching another fantastic game where Grandmaster Walter Braun finds an unimaginable sacrifice after thinking for 45 minutes. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.